Hello, and welcome back to Exodus 17's Outreach Masterclass. One of the things pertaining to outreach that people find the hardest is turning a conversation into a spiritual one. The authors of the book, The Simplest Way to Change the World, said that it can feel like going to a middle school dance every time we talk about Jesus. I mean, you bump into each other while you're getting the mail, or you're out on a walk and see them in the neighborhood and you're talking about football or the weather. How do you turn it into a spiritual conversation? Because you don't want to be that weirdo who's like, yeah, running is good for your heart, but Jeremiah 17:9 says that the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. You have to run to Jesus to change that. And then they're like, okay, and sprint out of there. Hey, good instincts. You realize that forcing a transition in topic like that is not natural and positive. Today we'll discover that the thing that we can do to make the transition to a spiritual conversation less obtuse is to use the power of questions. Sometimes we can overlook the power of questions because we believe that we have a message to deliver and we should be bold enough to just say it. While it's true that we should be bold, Colossians 4:5 and 6 says, be wise in the way that you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. Of course, Jesus was a master at this. Jesus asked at least 307 questions in the writings that we have about him. By modern communication standards, a highly disproportionate amount compared to his statements. Questions like, who do you say that I am? Why do you call me good? What do you want? Incredibly incisive questions that got to the heart, exposed beliefs, and set people on a different path. Oftentimes, good questions have the power to open doors that statements never could. There are other benefits too. Let me explain by sharing a tool with you called the Columbo tactic by Stand to Reason. The key to the Columbo tactic, which is named after the unassuming character of an old detective show, is that like that television character, a Christ follower can go on the offensive in an inoffensive way with carefully selected questions that can advance the conversation. And here's how you do it. When you're in a conversation where you want to make an impact for Jesus, the first thing that we should do is not to jump in and try and convert someone. Instead, the goal is to gather information in the conversation. Like Columbo, you're asking one more thing, and one more thing, and one more thing. But even though your questions may seem random, we know that the reality is that you're actually asking questions that gather information and make a point. A really good question to ask to gather more information is some version of, what do you mean by that? If someone says, I don't believe in God, you could ask, what do you mean? Or tell me more. Or what don't you believe? Or which God? You're drawing out more information so that if they can, and sometimes they can't, they can share where they're coming from. If someone says something like, I believe in science, I think all religions are the same, all Christians are judgmental hypocrites, we may be tempted to defend our beliefs with a contrary statement, or we may be shocked and not know what to say. Either way, ask some version of the question, what do you mean by that? Because if you do, it gives you the upper hand. It gives you more information, it gives you time to think, and it gives you an opportunity to reposition yourself in the conversation. You may say, what do you mean when you say believe? Or what about science do you believe? Or what about all religions is the same? Or what do you mean when you say judgmental or hypocritical? Here's why using the Columbo tactic is so great. Number one, it immediately engages the non-believer in an interactive way. Number two, it shows a genuine interest in the other person's view, which is polite and caring. Number three, it forces that person to think more carefully about exactly what he does believe. And four, you're now in the driver's seat in the conversation. So make it a habit when someone says something you disagree with to ask some version of, what do you mean by that? Now that you've discovered what they believe by asking that question, the next step is to ask them some version of the question, what led you to that conclusion? Which is basically asking someone why they believe what they believe. People understand that when they've made an assertion of what they think is true, it's on them to support that claim with some rationale. If someone says, the Bible is just a bunch of made-up stories, you would ask something like, why do you think that? Which is a version of what led you to that conclusion. And they may say, a professor I had told me that. Wow, what did he say that was so convincing? Question after question after question. And it's not rude, you're being courteous by assuming that they know what they believe and why they believe it. The reality is that a large percentage of the time, people don't have a very good reason to believe what they do. Maybe they've been socialized to believe it, or they simply prefer it over the alternative. But whether they know why they believe what they believe or not, you're being polite and gaining information. And people normally try, because the one who makes the claim bears the burden of proof. In some cases, it makes it painfully clear that they don't know what they're talking about. Or eventually, you may be able to say, "May I share an alternative perspective?" and share what you believe and why you believe it. But if nothing else, you're able to naturally interact about their thoughts and beliefs because they've put it out there. After asking these questions, you don't need to go anywhere with the conversation to try to persuade someone. Jesus' example, again, shows that he didn't always blow up the person who was talking to with a truth bomb. Oftentimes, he would just light a fire and let it simmer. The point is to get into conversations by asking good questions like, "What do you mean by that?" and "What led you to that conclusion?" And if people ask you good questions that you don't know how to answer, you don't have to answer right then and there. Out of the 183 questions that Jesus was asked in the Gospels, he only answered 3 of them directly. You can just say, "Let me think about it," and that way you can be ready to respond at a later time. There are so many benefits to asking questions instead of making statements, but I think that the greatest benefit is that it's relational to ask questions. It models God's interest in people by showing genuine interest and care. That's why I like to use a technique that I call the improv method. In improvisational comedy, the key to keeping an improvised skit going is the statement, "Yes, and." In other words, if someone in the skit decides to take the improv situation to the moon, you say, "Yes, and we encounter little green aliens." The thing that kills good improv comedy is the same thing that kills good spiritual conversations, and that is to ignore the other person's prompts and just go some direction you've already decided that you want to take. So try asking yes and questions. For example, a while ago, I had a project in my backyard. Backyard backstory was that we had a neighbor who tore down the fence between our yards without even talking about it, and he decided to not help replace it, so it was 100% on me. So a friend and I got pumped up about putting the new fence in like only guys can, senseless, testosterone-based hype, and we didn't call before we dug. And we cut an internet line, and a guy came out a few days later. He started digging the line while I was finishing the fence, and we got talking. And by the way, this is how every great evangelism story starts. Philip and the Ethiopian official, Paul and the Philippian jailer, etc. Something happened, a guy happened to be there, and we got talking. And that's 90% of good evangelism. So I just asked the guy questions about his job and his family, and it became clear that he used to be kind of a bad dude in his younger days, but now he believes that he and everybody else should be good. So that's the grand summation of his beliefs. So, true to the improv method, I didn't bother pointing out our differences in beliefs because that could lead to divisions and dead ends, so I tried yes and. So I agreed with his sentiment, yes, and we should all be good. And also, by the way, do you believe in heaven or hell? To which he said yes, and then I asked him, how good does someone have to be to go there? Game, set, and match, right? A mumbled out, incoherent answer, and I got to say something. It was less than 5% of the conversation, but I told him about what I believed about a perfect God and an impossible leap for flawed people to be in that perfect place with him, and how his perfect son who said, only God is good, made the only way. And he super appreciated it and wanted to start a correspondence. So the key to the improv method is to just find what you affirm about what the person says or believes, and then ask questions that add to it, build on it, and see where it takes you. This is the opposite of trying to force an agenda on the interaction. It's a relationship building, interested and caring approach that increases openness. Author Don Everts remarked on the findings of research done by Barna and said, when non-Christians have experienced vibrancy, personal care, intelligence, reasonableness, and a gentle, non-judgmental approach from Christians, their spiritual curiosity overall and their interest in Christianity specifically are elevated. And that brings us to the final powerful questions tool from Dare to Share Ministry called Ask, Admire, Admit. What ask, admire, and admit means is that to bridge into a conversation with someone, you start by taking the time to ask them a bunch of questions. That gives you a sense of who they are and what they're about. And when you find something that's good about them, you admire it. Don't do it with silly things like, hey, nice shoes, because that's kind of a dead end. Admire something about how their words or actions reveal goodness or truth. It's awesome because it's always encouraging and positive, like, oh my gosh, did you draw that or make that coffee or design this? That is so creative. Or, I can't believe you stood up for that or said that or posted that on your feed. That was totally the right thing to do. And then admit your values and why. I love anything beautiful and unique because I think God made people to be beautiful and unique. What do you think? Or, I love it when people stand up for justice because I think that God cares about justice. What do you think? You get it. This is such a great technique because it's encouraging. People love to talk about themselves, and honestly, it's encouraging to us to see the good in people. A couple of more examples. In asking, I hear a barista tell me that she would like prayer for her kids. So I admire her by saying, that is so cool that you're paying prayer forward to your kids. You must love them more than anything. And then admit, that's totally what Jesus did for us when he gave everything away. I respect that. Were you like raised in church or... In asking, I hear an employee gripe about how they're always opening or closing the store because nobody else steps up. I admire them by saying, man, that must really stink, but I'm grateful there are faithful people like you in the world. And then admit, I know every day God is faithful to watch over me. Are you religious? Because that's pretty next level. Here's my most recent real-life example. I heard that a guy was writing a philosophical book about what rules should govern people. So I asked if I could read a sample because I fancy myself a bit of a writer, and in it he said stuff like, basically people shouldn't hurt people. So I was like, you're totally right, that is a stellar insight, and I totally agree because, and then I admit to saying, I see that in the 10 Commandments of the Bible. But Jesus took it even further when he said that not only should we do no harm, but we should do to others what we would have them do to us. So now it's proactive. I see that you share some of the same values. Were you inspired by the 10 Commandments or Jesus' words at all? Ask, admire, admit. Just another way that we can use powerful questions to open up the door to conversations about faith. A recent survey showed that 61% of millennials think that people are more likely now than in the past to see them as offensive if they share their faith. So often, they just won't share their faith. But you're not going to be striking up a conversation with a complete stranger and ambushing them with talk of sin and hell. There is a way to share your faith that people actually appreciate. In fact, in contrast to millennials' beliefs about how people will receive it, people surveyed say that they're glad about the last spiritual conversation they had. 77% of Christians and 55% of non-Christians are glad for it. But it has to be a conversation, and conversations require good questions. Asking good questions, showing genuine care, sharing once we've earned it. Wouldn't it be surprising if it were way easier than we made it out to be? Wouldn't it be surprising if it were more fulfilling than we thought that it was? Wouldn't it be surprising if it was far more effective than we could have imagined? That is the underappreciated power of questions for outreach. So let's get better at asking better questions. Or maybe I should say, what incredible things could happen if you got better at asking questions? Thanks. We'll see you next time.